Hello everyone and welcome to the latest Work Foundation event looking at the changing state of the UK labour market, where today we're going to be looking at the implications of the latest labour market data just released this morning and putting it into some context around other updates on the performance of the economy, inflation and the government's policy agenda for the remainder of 2025 and the Parliament. My name's Ben Harrison. I'm director here at the Work Foundation, a research and policy think tank, which is part of Lancaster University. And for those of you who don't know us, we're committed to supporting everyone to access well-paid, secure employment. And our current work programme is particularly focused on job insecurity for those who face structural disadvantage within the labour market and the interrelationship between health and work. Of course, those are very relevant topics because such a big focus of the government remains on the health of the UK labour market, the issue of economic inactivity and those who've fallen out or are at risk of falling out of the labour market due to ill health. Now, quite a lot has happened over recent weeks on all of those issues. We've seen the government try and fail ultimately to introduce cuts to the welfare system. The economy is contracted for 2 months in succession. New inflation data this week was higher than anticipated. And today, the latest data from the ONS suggests that hiring is slowing, wage growth is reducing, and unemployment could be on the rise as well. All of which leaves us with the bigger question as to whether the government is in danger of being blown off course in its central missions to grow the economy, drive up living standards, and support more people into secure and well-paid work. To help us discuss that question and the wider landscape, I'm delighted that we're going to be hearing from a fantastic panel of contributors today. We're joined by Naomi Clayton, who's Chief Executive at the Institute for Employment Studies, Delphine Strauss, Economics Correspondent at the Financial Times, and Sriskandarajah, CEO of the New Economics Foundation. Before we hear their initial reflections, I do want to just briefly set out some of the latest data from this morning. So if we can pull up the slides, please, that would be great. So as they come up, it bears repeating every month that the ONS continues to work through reliability issues with the labour force survey and includes a whole host of caveats with the data each month as it's seeking to improve survey response rates. So there is a decent chance that a lot of what we're talking about today will be subject to future revision. But nevertheless, based on the data that we do have, it appears that the employment rate is up on the year at 75.2%, but that unemployment is also up at its highest level for 4 years at around 4.7%. Now, put that into a longer historical context, and that isn't particularly high necessarily, but clearly in terms of recent years, it does stand out somewhat. Vacancies have decreased for 36 consecutive quarters and are now below pre-pandemic levels. They're currently around 727,000 vacancies, and that's a fall of 56,000 on the quarter. And economic inactivity, which has dominated so much political and labour market discourse over recent years, has fallen to 21%. In percentage terms, that's the lowest it's been since the onset of the pandemic. It's down around 375,000 people on the year. And I suppose when you take all of that together, it's correct that could be reflective of a reduction in business confidence to recruit as costs have risen with the increase in employer national insurance contributions, for example. But it could equally be a case that we're seeing more people moving out of economic inactivity and into unemployment as they begin to look for work. It'd be good to explore that through this afternoon. Regular average pay growth has slowed to 5% on the year, and wages are just £26 a week higher in real terms than they were at the start of the global financial crisis. And I think we've seen over the course of the last couple of weeks with a large group of MPs from the Labour Party raising this as a priority, that in some respects the cost of living crisis, although it may be through its most acute phase, is not over. And actually years of stagnating wages mean that in a recent Work Foundation survey, we found that 1 in 6 workers are struggling to pay bills, and 4 in 10 say they've got very little or nothing left over from their pay at the end of the month. So, some big challenges to get stuck into. And to begin the conversation, I'd like to bring in Naomi Clayton to provide her perspective on the latest data and the labour market and economic picture as a whole. Just to say that anyone who would like to raise a question or a reflection for our speakers as we open the conversation out in a little while, please do so through the questions function. and I'll bring those in as we go. For now, though, over to you, Naomi.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ben. So for those of you that don't know Institute for Employment Studies, we're an independent centre for applied research and insight on employment, skills and labour markets. And each month we take a look at the labour market data and try to make sense of what's happening in the labour market. And we publish a monthly briefing on our website. And I think, as Ben has already set out, there are clear signs that the labour market is continuing to cool. And, you know, we've seen another significant drop in the number of payrolled employees. And, you know, aside from a small increase in January, payroll numbers have been continually falling since October. I think it's worth noting that outside of the pandemic and since 2014, where we've got payroll data from, this is the most prolonged fall in the number of payrolled employees outside of the pandemic. So quite a significant and steep fall in payroll numbers. Ben's already said that we've seen vacancies fall for the 36th consecutive quarter. We've seen decline across most sectors, so 14 out of 18 sectors, and vacancies overall have fallen by around 17% compared to last year, and vacancies are now well below pre-pandemic levels. Obviously, pay growth is slowing, and firms expect it to that pay growth to slow further, although it is still high by historical standards. I think it's interesting there to look at the kind of pay distribution and change across the distribution, and you can see the impacts of the national minimum wage on pay growth for lower paid workers, which is broadly positive. But clearly, low paying sectors overall are struggling with increased costs and have been, it seems, affected by the increases in national insurance contributions. So when we look at the change in payroll numbers across sectors, we can see that hospitality has been amongst the hardest hit, with one of the largest falls in payroll numbers over the last year. I think it's also interesting to look at what's happened over the last quarter across sectors in terms of payroll numbers, and you're seeing obviously quite significant continued falls in some of the low paid sectors, but also in professional services too, which I think highlights the kind of combination of challenges businesses are facing at the moment. The kind of increased costs through the increases to employer taxes, but also just generally that kind of ongoing global uncertainty, the impacts potentially of AI coming through, and some of the knock-on impacts of the reduced business investment in R&D that we've also seen. So clearly a combination of factors playing out there. Interesting too to see that we're seeing quite significant falls in London, you know, with a big service sector economy, quite significant falls in payroll numbers amongst 18 to 24-year-olds, so young people being hit particularly hard. And I think all of this really kind of reflects the need for government to move swiftly on with the kind of implementation of the new industrial strategy, but also the Get Britain Working plans, really focusing on supporting people into the right jobs for them, and enabling kind of choice in terms of job outcomes. But clearly falling demand in the jobs market at the moment is a significant issue. and challenge.
Brilliant. Thank you, Naomi. I'm definitely going to be asking you a bit more about all of those issues when we get into the open conversation. But for now, I'm asking you to turn your camera off and I'll hand over to Delphine to offer her initial reflections.
Hello. Am I audible now?
Yes, all good.
Great, thanks. So I'm Delphine Strauss. I'm economics correspondent at the FT, and I focus a lot on labour markets. I've been covering this data for some time in its many permutations and sort of ups and downs. And I'll cover some of the same ground as Naomi, but perhaps also focus a little bit on what we don't know from the numbers we've had out today. So starting on what it does show us, yes, we have this really clear weakening over the last year in payroll employment, which has been more persistent and clear-cut since the budget changes on national insurance and minimum wages were announced. It's clear that has had a really persistent effect on employers' behaviour, even though the sort of backdrop of global economic uncertainty has not helped. One thing I should say, though, is that what today's data really shows us is that this hasn't been quite as bad as people feared. So there was a really big revision to the figure the ONS had previously given for payrolls in May, and backward revisions to quite a lot of the months before that, which does mean that this drop we've had in payroll employment is about 100,000 people smaller than we previously thought. It's weakening, but it's not collapsing, and that's going to be quite reassuring for policymakers. We do still have strong wage growth, rising at about 5% over the last year, and that's ahead of inflation. Slightly worrying from a price pressure point of view, slightly reassuring from a worker's point of view. I suppose what it means is we're looking at a market where employers are neither hiring nor firing very much. Redundancy rates have risen, but they're sort of close to pre-pandemic rates. They're not too alarming. Vacancies have come down. The overall picture is maybe a sort of fragile situation that's particularly bad for new entrants to the labour market. We don't have very good visibility on what's happening to young people. And that's unfortunate because the hints we do have are that both graduates and non-graduates might be suffering quite a bit at the moment. It's an environment where the government will be very wary of any further policy changes that might add to labour costs, whether that's national insurance or whether it's, possibly new obligations to do a bit more to look after workers' health. It's going to be a sensitive area, anything that would add cost. It's also looking like a difficult labour market for the task the government has to try and get sick and disabled people back into work. Not an easy environment to persuade people to hire in. Perhaps from there, though, I should move to what we still don't know from today's numbers, because of the uncertainty we still have around the labour force survey. The ONS has been doing a lot of work to repair it. The response rates have come up. We think the numbers probably are telling us something useful now. But what we can't do is compare them with figures from a year ago, or even from a quarter ago. So it's probably giving us a better snapshot of where the labour market is right now, but it still doesn't really quite tell us how it's evolved. The number I find most interesting in the LFS data from today is on inactivity, which looks quite a bit lower than we thought at 21%. We don't really know whether that's an improvement or whether it's simply a better read than we had before. It looks as if, insofar as there's been an improvement, it's among working age, sort of prime working age period people, with fewer people saying they're at home with family responsibilities. Does that mean that Jeremy Hunt's very expensive childcare subsidy did get parents into work? Who knows? That's something we'd love to know more about. The other thing I would really love to know more about is what's happening to self-employment. On the face of it, the tax changes in April will have widened the gap in tax treatment between an employee and a self-employed person. you might expect that to push more employers to try and hire contractors rather than having full-time employees. But we really don't know from the LFS data whether that's happening or not. Likewise, youth unemployment, really big number that we can't quite trust at the moment. So I think my priority for later in the year would be for, various areas of government to be doing everything they possibly can to fill in those gaps in the data.
Brilliant, thank you, Delphine. And I mean, I think again we'll get into more of all of that as we go into the conversation. But the way you described there, the sort of labour market, almost as being in a bit of stasis in a sense, or at that crossroads, but potentially particularly bad for new entrants to the labour market. Notwithstanding what you've just said there on trusting youth employment data, I'd love to talk a bit more about that as we get going. But Danny, finally, I'll come to you to offer your initial reflections, and then we'll open it out into a wider conversation.
Thanks, Ben, and hi, everyone. I'm Danny Sriskandarajah. I'm at the New Economics Foundation, an independent think tank that's been around for about 40 years. I've only been here for about a year and a bit, and it's been about 15 or 20 years since I last worked in a sort of think tank environment. And I just want to build on particularly what Delphine was saying, because when I was last around 15, 20 years ago and using LFS data, many of us, most of us had concerns about methodologies and quality of data and all of that in such a critical piece of information for society and policymakers. And so, I just want to add what I suspect is a shared frustration that here we are still waiting for the sort of quality and consistency of data that we need to really guide policy and good policy making in this area. And it's a little bit better than it seems to have been in the 15 years ago, but hey, not as good as it needs to be. And then Ben, the other thing that's really worrying us is the stuff you've talked about already, that the Work Foundation and others have been doing to highlight the real pressures and cost of living issues that linger. The sort of headline data suggest we're moving in the right direction on a number of fronts, wage increase, for example, but the lived experience for huge proportions of British society is the opposite, and people are feeling less well off, more insecure, as your data has shown. But I worry about a sort of policy challenge, which is that we're not getting that sort of nuance in the sort of top level policy goals or ambitions of this government. I mean, if you look at the missions, for example, it was reassuring that the government published its plan for change in December. Some of you may remember that the sort of, there were the big 5 missions that the government was elected, or the Labour Party was elected on through its manifesto. And then in December, it published the plan for change, which looked at slightly more detailed, granular level of what are those sort of key milestones on the road to those missions. And what's disappointing is there was a little bit of an attempt to look at things like real disposable household income, but all still at an aggregate level and not differentiating enough on what's happening in terms of distributional impacts across the labour force, or indeed distributional across geographies in this country. We're still one of the most regionally unequal countries in the OECD. And so those, there's sort of data concerned, and then there's a cost of living and insecurity concern that's really top of mind for us. I don't want to repeat a lot of what Naomi and Delphine have said, and but I do want to focus on the thing that's sort of occupying my colleagues' attention and time here at NEF, and that is what's happening around the interface between unemployment and work, the sort of proposed changes on universal credit and the sort of cuts to disability and health benefits. And I suspect lots of people on the call have been very preoccupied by what's been going on in Parliament, in particular around the government's proposed changes. In some ways, things are not as bad as many of us would have feared, and the sort of planned cuts were pared back because of, as I'm sure lots of us have been following in recent months. But our concern is that the sort of long-term solutions to getting more people into work, particularly into good work, still feel a long way away. And take conditionality, for example. We were quite pleased to see the sort of idea of backgrounding conditionality in the welfare system in the white paper last year. Lots of us, I suspect, including the Work Foundation, were pushing hard for taking a more sensible approach to conditionality. But that seems to have been sort of dropped, and there's much more of a focus on a sort of punitive approach. And similarly on the sort of good quality job, it's been heartening to see some talk of that. I mean, many of you will remember that Rachel Reeves, when she talked about securonomics, for example, a few years ago, and indeed wrote a pamphlet on it, she talked about good jobs, decent pay, strong public services being at the heart of securonomics. But there too, I think we have some concerns that yes, fine, pay on aggregate or average levels has been going up, but not necessarily for many segments of society. The good quality jobs don't necessarily seem to be there, and some of the measures that you might have to incentivize people into work through good, attractive jobs don't seem to be working as well as they should be. And of course, there's a public services element to all of this around not just how the welfare system operates, but a whole range of other services that need to be in place to provide the sort of social protection that people feeling insecure might need. And there too, we're not seeing the sort of necessary investments, I think. So yeah, sort of aggregate level, some good news, but really worrying things sitting behind the numbers and the numbers themselves. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Danny. And Naomi and Delphine, if you can pop your cameras on now, then we'll sort of continue the conversation together. And we've already had some questions coming in, which is fantastic. So please do pop reflections and questions into the Q&A tab. But just to sort of maybe develop a little bit further, Danny, what you were just saying there, is your sense, or is your feeling really, that the government is in danger of sort of missing a moment really in terms of its level of ambition for reform? And you mentioned around the welfare system, obviously a lot of the focus ended up becoming around cuts, and actually the sort of more transformational reform, or how we think about the welfare system, hasn't necessarily really been engaged with fully. Is that your sense, that essentially we have these very large challenges? Labour has articulated missions and ambitions for change, but we're not really seeing the kind of depth of reform to match up to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, if you look at the manifesto commitments, the ambition behind the missions, all of that is good stuff. But, here we are a year and a bit on, and it feels like, the government is sort of not just under delivering on the ambition, but scaling back on some of that ambition. And I worry about that because, those people on the call who work on the welfare system will know that often is the case that parties in opposition say, the last thing you should do is punish those people on benefits. That's never going to fix the system. You need to create a best system. And the moment they get into government, the tune changes. And we've seen a bit of that as well, I think. And that's the sort of, for the conditionality point that I was trying to make a little bit earlier. But also in this case, if you just broaden the lens a bit, widen the lens, here we are where the sort of so-called fiscal rules, the rules that the Chancellor has set herself around public expenditure in particular, and borrowing and all of that, that's what seems to be driving decision-making on, the cuts, not the sort of ambition that was in the mission, or even sort of sensible evidence-based policy making about what might work. And that's a really dangerous place to be, because you've got, you're so reliant on tiny little bits of growth to give you the sort of so-called fiscal headroom, or, you're hoping for the best when it comes to aggregate growth. That's not the right way to drive long-term of transformative policy change. And so there really is a moment, you call this sort of, at the crossroads. I do think we're at the crossroads. The original intent from this government was great. Some of the early signals were great, but now they've sort of tied both hands, if you will, in their ability to be able to make the transformative change they need.
It's really interesting. Delphine, could you maybe pick up on some of that? Because I mean, you sort of, I think, articulated a notion of a crossroads in terms of potentially the sort of state of the labour market and the economy itself. And I just wondered, from your perspective at the FT, maybe building on some of what Danny's described there, is there a sort of, how worried should ministers be that, in a sense, the narrative begins to shift this, a year into the Parliament, that the sort of big ambitions that the government has laid out, the reality is we're sort of seeing, whatever we might think of the data underpinning it, we're seeing sort of hundreds of thousands of jobs lost, or at best, heightened uncertainty around that, and that ultimately they're going to fail in meeting those ambitions.
I mean, I think it's fair to say that the claim that there was an absolute number one mission to drive economic growth above all else has lost quite a lot of its shine over the last year, through circumstance in part. There's been a push into this big surge in defence spending that was not intended, not foreseen, and is never where you would go first if you really wanted to do everything for growth. They are trying to make the best of it with a narrative about putting as much of that defence spending as they can into R&D, and into local areas, but there's only so much you can do. And clearly that has detracted from some of the other things you would want to do about, investment in transport in all of the regions, various other things that would be more growth enhancing. There have been genuinely useful things around capital investment, around infrastructure, around the industrial strategy. It's not that everything's fallen by the wayside, but there's certainly a bit of a loss of momentum. And a lot of these things take a very long time to pay off against a difficult short-term backdrop. When it comes to the welfare changes, I mean, you couldn't imagine more of a political car crash. The actual substance of the reforms as they stand now look a lot closer to what people might have been able to reach consensus on in the first place. We effectively have a change of the incentives within UC, which I think most people did agree had got a bit skewed. And we have a long-term consultation over what to do with the, very significant amounts of money that might not be best spent at the moment through PIP. It's very unfortunate to be starting that consultation having just totally burned everybody's trust in the system, but there we are. One moves on. I mean, I think I would also just back up what Danny was saying on this sense of, minute calculations on OBR headroom do seem to have been driving policy much more than they did in the past. It's partly a function of the way they've rewritten the fiscal rules, but it's also simply because there is so little headroom. There isn't a big enough market margin for error when markets are much more jumpy than they used to be about the UK's fiscal position. And there's some really difficult choices to be made if you want to get back into a position where you've got, enough margin for error to start setting policy more sensibly without having to jump every time something shifts in the forecasts.
Yeah. So I definitely want to come back to that idea of some of the tough choices that government faces, particularly over the next 6 to 12 months in some of that. But Naomi, coming to you, again, feel free to pick up on sort of points that Danny and Delphine have made. But I also just wondered whether you had reflections on, in particular, kind of the government's target to boost employment up to 80%, and whether you feel that's a sort of an appropriate target, a realistic target, given what we seem to be getting from the latest data with all of those caveats around it. Is that something which is going to continue to sort of animate policymakers, do you feel, over the rest of the Parliament?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess, the 80% employment rate, I think, should be seen as a long-term ambition rather than a kind of specific target. And I've said before that I think, arguments around kind of whether that 80% employment rate is achievable or not kind of misses the point. It's about having that scale of ambition that drives improvements across services and across the system. So I think it is the right level of ambition. I think, obviously, as we've talked about, the kind of labour market context makes that ambition all the more difficult to achieve. I think it's worth bearing in mind kind of, the latest figures and kind of latest trends sit against the kind of longer term challenges in the labour market, which we've kind of already touched on, but record levels of people out of work due to long-term sickness, some really persistent employment gaps, so disabled people being 2.5 times more likely to be out of work compared to non-disabled people, and some really significant geographic inequalities too. And these are really kind of long-term issues and challenges that the labour market has been facing, as well as some of the challenges in terms of, fragmentation with kind of skills and employment support, kind of low levels of trust, people's perceptions in terms of, how helpful the support that they've received through Job Centre Plus is. So a kind of number of challenges on both sides. And I think the government has been right to set kind of the level of ambition that it has and look at the long-term changes that are required in the system. I think in general, in the employment labour market space, kind of things have suffered by the amount of kind of policy change, kind of short-term funding, and so it's good to focus on the long term. I think the challenge is people need support now, and we're seeing the labour market kind of continuing to cool, and we need action now, which is why we need to, I think there's a number of very sensible reforms that have been set out through the Get Britain Working plan. It's really encouraging to see additional employment support being protected through the kind of pathways to work kind of programmes. But we need to move, as I said previously, we need to really focus on implementation now.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and I think that sort of long-term and short-term dynamic is definitely something which I want to come back to too. But just Andrew Phillips has sort of popped a question in the Q&A tab, which I wonder whether you may have reflections on, Naomi, or others. It's something which has come up for a few months now, really, around is that the sort of apparent contradiction between relatively high wage growth alongside rising unemployment and falling vacancies, and exactly how we can explain that. And I think he posits, is this a sort of catch up after a period of very high inflation? But it'd be great to get reflections on that as to why we're seeing, that kind of collection of data together, which may be counterintuitive. I don't know, Naomi, do you have sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it does seem slightly contradictory on the face of it. I think there are a number of things possibly going on there in terms of wages continuing to play catch up with the kind of falls that we've seen in real wages because of high levels of inflation. Possibly also some of the lag effects. So, vacancies falling first, which then we may well see that kind of feed through into kind of continued slowing of pay growth, and indeed businesses are expecting pay growth to slow, so we might well see that trend there kind of following some of the changes that we've seen in terms of drop in payroll numbers and fall in vacancies, and then there's probably a kind of set of kind of sectoral and structural issues playing out too. So differences across different sectors, the impacts of the national minimum wage, which, as I mentioned, we can see the boost to low paid workers' wages in the kind of pay distribution figures, but at the same time falling vacancies in kind of low-paid sectors. So there are probably a few things going on there that help to perhaps explain that apparent contradiction
that we may see play out over sort of coming months. Danny, really happy for you to reflect on that as well. But I wanted to kind of move us on a little bit and sort of maybe pick up on some of the themes that you've each sort of introduced. And I just wonder what you would say to the idea that there is this sort of fundamental contradiction between the government wanting to make work more secure, wanting to support more people who have health challenges into work, alongside driving growth in the economy. And I think it was a concern sort of Delphine raised that, you know, the environment to do some of these things is perhaps becoming more challenging, not less. And I wonder what you'd say to that argument and how we sort of thread our way through that.
Yeah, it's a great way of framing it, and I think that's the route to sort of, that's the way out for this government, or indeed for society, right? I mean, it always staggers me that we end up thinking about the economy as somehow, you know, that we are in service of the economy, whereas the way that humans choose to organize economic life surely is to nurture human flourishing. That, you know, the economy is in service of us, not us in service of the economy. And yet almost, you know, so much of what we read about and how economic policy is discussed is the other way around. And there lies, I think, the sort of, you know, where we need governments need to be focusing, which is how do you support sort of human flourishing, securonomics, the everyday economy, the foundational economy, all these different terms that are being applied to what we're trying to describe, which is that people, you know, have a decent pay, a decent standard of living, feel relatively secure in their life. And I think there are, you know, part of that is around the sort of welfare to work, the conditionality, good work type thing. And you know, building on what Naomi was saying earlier, you know, part of what might be going on is that the sort of the basic economic or mainstream economic assumption that sort of that wages or prices will somehow affect, you know, the sort of transmission that one might have assumed between wage growth and employment doesn't necessarily hold, because other things are going on. And so this has to be about sort of good quality work. It's also about public services. Like we're doing we're hoping to work with Andy Burnham and the Greater Manchester Combined Authority to do a pilot around living income, which is this notion that you know, that people who are on benefits are paid a living income, so much more than they currently get through the Universal Credit Scheme, that it's less conditional. And then the important bit is that public services and other bits of social protection that could help people feel more secure are also redeployed in a more intentional way to support and nurture the sort of feelings of security. And we want to do a pilot in Manchester around that. That's about sort of taking the existing system and tweaking it sufficiently to be about giving people a greater sense of security. It will cost a little bit more, not much more, but then there's sort of long-term payoffs, including for economic growth and, you know, good quality, sustainable growth at the sort of foundational level, rather than in the sort of, you know, aggregate financial services type growth that often tends to dominate. That's, you know, that you can undo the seeming contradiction, I think, focusing on those bits of economic life.
That sounds like such a fantastic example, actually, and what I wanted to sort of bring you in on, Delphine. So, I mean, you mentioned the sort of headroom conundrum that the government faces, or is sort of presented to itself in a sense, in how it's drafted its rules. And as we've already mentioned, this sort of tension between long-term and short-term. But as Danny's just sort of outlined it there, I suppose in some respects what we might be talking about here are transition costs that actually, as we move and we introduce reform, we acknowledge that there are going to be costs felt, whether that's by employers or for public services or what have you, but with a view to either generating more growth, productivity, or better health and well-being outcomes in the future, which will in the end see a dividend. And you might expect the state to invest or provide subsidies in order to do that. The question becomes whether they're able to or prepared to and sort of can do that alongside their sort of fiscal rules. And I just wondered what you thought about that, whether there will be this appetite from government to sort of put that money in where it might be needed in order to start seeing more systemic change.
I don't know. I mean, I think this is probably going to be a relatively small part of the pressured picture pressured position we're going to be in the run up to the budget. I mean, one thing that's quite noticeable about the policies the government has set out already on the DWP side for boosting employment is that while they are all very sensible sounding and answer a lot of concerns that have been there for years, there isn't that much money behind them yet. The youth guarantee, for example, has quite a small amount of money for a few pilots and, has a great policy framing, but it's not obvious how much it'll amount to. There is now a genuinely quite substantial amount of money going into job support for the sick and disabled. Not quite clear whether it's coming at the cost of some other forms of employment support. I'm just not sure that this is the main thing in the overall macro picture of what happens to the labour market over the next couple of years, though. They're just bigger macro forces in play.
Oh, has Ben disappeared?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, sorry, Ben has disappeared, so I'll take over for a moment. I'm John Fitzmaurice at the Work Foundation. So, sorry, we were just there on the macroeconomic picture. Would any of the other speakers like to pick up on any of those points from Delphine? Moment.
Can I just a quick build, please, on all of the sort of the headroom and the cuts and the fiscal rules today, and the challenges we face today pale into insignificance when you play this forward. So the OBR's own forecast suggests that by 2050, public spending will need to be about 60-odd% of GDP if we continue to provide the same services and have the same expectations of the state, if you take into account demographic factors and so on. But the tax base under the current rules, again, playing forward demography and all of that, will only yield about 40% of GDP. So the percentage point gap rises to something like 20 in terms of the sort of what what the tax base will yield and what public spending. So in some ways, this is what I find really frustrating about the sort of short-term nature of so much of both the sort of measures taken by government, but also the debate that we have around policymaking. We need to really think about how, what is the nature of the state that we would like? How do we have any chance of funding it in a sustainable way? And of course, the future of work is critical to all of that, because the sort of 20th century assumption that taxes on work are going to yield the sorts of the revenues needed to pay for the bulk of what the state does may not hold if the nature of work itself is going to transform quite significantly over the next couple of decades. So there are some really big picture questions that are going to be fundamental that I fear very few of us have. I hear very little about in the political debate.
Thank you, Danny. I'm going to go to a couple of audience questions which sort of link into that point there. So there's a question from an anonymous attendee around the role of AI. So I suppose linking into how the workforce or the labour market might change in coming years. And we've seen quite a few stories in the media about AI having a particular impact on the level of demand of early careers and young professionals. Do we think this is a direct result, or are there other things at play that we've slightly been talking about earlier on the conversation? Can I bring any of the panelists in there, maybe Naomi or Delphine?
Yeah, I can come in if you like, because we've been trying to look at this quite hard over the last couple of weeks. So lots of worry that AI is going to destroy the first rungs in graduate careers across a whole load of white-collar occupations that haven't been as vulnerable to automation before. Really, really hard to work out whether it's happening now. you see the most telling possible signs in a few areas of the tech sector, where there's been a big rush of young people training in coding skills that seemed like they were definitely the best route to a well-paid job, and then possibly this oversupply hitting the market just as AI becomes capable of doing a lot of the low-level tasks. But it's still really hard to disentangle that from the fact that we had a sector that massively expanded straight after COVID, had a big retrenchment, is still going through that to some extent. And then when you look across other sectors where there's a lot of speculation, law, accountancy, some other big graduate employers, it's very hard to see anything clear in the data yet. I do speak to people in particular niches who say, yes, you just don't see this particular thing interns used to do being needed anymore or being advertised anymore. But we honestly can't find any very clear correlation yet between the occupations that we think are exposed to AI and the places that jobs are being advertised most.
Great. Naomi, would you like to?
And just to add to that, I think, clearly, lots of studies have kind of focused on the impacts of AI on entry-level jobs. As Delphine has said, how that will play out in kind of practice, and it's kind of yet to be seen. I think when we're kind of looking at kind of youth employment, I think there are some I guess potentially concerning trends and factors that kind of potentially interplay to impact on young people's employment. So not just kind of the impacts of AI on entry-level jobs, but the kind of continuing kind of knock-on impacts of the pandemic on that kind of cohort that was most affected, the mental health crisis amongst kind of young people, and kind of the impacts of other changing kind of labour market trends in terms of kind of hybrid work too, kind of trying to understand how those combination of factors will impact on young people's employment and progression, like career and progression opportunities, I think is really important. But as Delphine has said, it's quite difficult to do at the moment because of some of the challenges in the labour market data. But I think it's important to understand kind of the impacts of things like AI against kind of other factors too.
And Danny, would you sort of come in there we're talking particularly about the impacts on young people now, but what about in the future, where the role of AI, against a sort of 80% employment target, people sort of, the AI or robots stole my job, but how can we use AI well to drive a better labour market?
Well, I work in a think tank where our entire industry is at risk of redundancy. But apparently in the US is already the first think tank that's basically producing only AI-generated reports now. So, but I wonder if I could just sort of segue, I mean, using your prompt to the sort of question about skills that's also in the chat there from, I think, Lindsay. Because part of the part of the solution is about skilling up, particularly the existing cohort of workforce to be able to, work more productively and have good quality jobs in a very rapidly changing marketplace. And that's going to be relevant in terms of the sort of disruptions brought by AI. It's just as relevant in terms of the green transition. We know that, for example, we have a serious skill shortage when it comes to those critical jobs, heat pump installers, for example, that are going to be necessary to drive a fast and fair transition. And so, obviously we've got to get it right for the next generation of workers and the sort of education and training system. But in terms of existing workers, the sort of NEF analysis is that we need a different policy approach to how we pay for that sort of investment in skills. We've actually got a sort of package of policies that we'd like to see government roll out, which we call the national skilling wage. And the base, in very brief, it's the idea that people who do go on reskilling in work are paid effectively a living wage, and that that's recouped by employers from a discount on employer NI, not relief against corporate tax that they pay. So it's a couple of innovations there about giving workers, a better living, decent income when they do go on sort of reskilling, but also employers, particularly those who aren't necessarily in profit, an incentive to be able to, recover some of the costs of that training via employer NI. So, it's things like that we need to be doing if we know that there are some big changes coming down the line to the nature of work and what sort of jobs are needed. Then I think government also needs to be rethinking the way that we incentivize and pay for reskilling.
And I'd like to sort of bring Naomi and Delphine in on that sort of point about, I suppose, the incentivization there of the changes to the labour market, and bringing one question in, which is about incentivizing, but around disabled workers and supporting them back into work, is around cuts potentially around access to work, so that and the support that employers get, but a general sort of question there around incentivizing as the labour market changes. So if I go to Naomi and then Delphine, and then we'll end with our sort of final question.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, Delphine's earlier point around kind of disability employment and, supporting more disabled people with long-term health conditions into work will be all the more challenging in a kind of cooling labour market. We know if we look at kind of spatial inequalities, that the disability employment gap is far narrower in kind of more buoyant local economies. So, job demand, buoyancy of the economy really does matter. But I think there are a series of things that we need to look at in terms of support and incentives for employers to hire kind of disabled people with health conditions. And I think unless we do that, we're not going to change the dial on this. I think that partly needs to be about increasing support through access to work rather than scaling it back. We know we've got a number of issues in terms of kind of wait lists, awareness of access to work and perceptions on what support can be provided through that. And if anything, we need to be investing more in that type of support. And I think it's very encouraging that Charlie Mayfield, in his review of kind of Keep Britain Working, is looking at how to support more employers to kind of retain people with kind of health conditions and disabilities and support them to stay in work through kind of case management. So there's an argument for more support for employers in terms of managing kind of workplace health too. But generally, there's discussions around disability pay gap reporting and the kind of range. I think we need to be looking at a range of different levers and incentives for employers, as well as what support can be provided to employers. I think, quite often that has been lacking, whether we're looking at support for people who are already in work, who are at risk of falling out of work, but also people who are looking for work too. Evaluations that we've done of past employment programmes show that programmes tend to fall down on employer engagement, and so kind of working with employers around kind of recruitment, job design, all the things that support people to kind of find suitable jobs. So I think there's much more that we can and should be doing in that space.
Thank you very much, Naomi. And Delphine, do you want to come in on that sort of point around investment? I suppose the challenges that employers and government face within the sort of difficult fiscal environment, but to help support people to stay in and get back into work.
So I think, as Naomi was saying, it would be really helpful to have more of a discussion about whether you would need more systematic state-provided financial incentives for employers to hire people who are maybe quite a long way from the labour market at the moment. I think one of the things around minimum wage policy is that while it's been extremely successful at boosting the minimum wage without an impact on headline employment, people do now say that it's at a level where it becomes more difficult to hire some people who are maybe never going to be as productive per hour as others. There was this idea of light work that sort of, employers used to make available maybe for people with health issues or whatever it was, that just doesn't really exist anymore. And you do see a lot of the employers in the sectors that are most exposed to labour costs just sort of doing everything they can to kind of, squeeze absolutely everything they can out of the people who are on shift at any one time. You sort of see hotel chains where the receptionist also does the rooms and also does, sort of 6 other jobs, so that you never have an idle moment during your shift. And I do wonder whether it's sort of there's now a case for just looking at, I don't know how one structures an incentive, and I think it'd be very difficult to design, because we saw with Kickstart in the pandemic that these schemes can be quite difficult to get right and sort of not make them create too much dead weight or sort of go unused. But it would be a helpful discussion to have, I think.
It's a good challenge, and I'm going to give all of the panel a very tough final assignment. So if you could make a quick final statement on how can the government get back on track during the remainder of 2025, and what particular policy you would like them to do, or challenge you'd set them. And if we could have that in like 20 to 30 seconds, I would be very, very grateful, each of you. Danny, would you mind going first?
Yeah, I think drop the growth ambition and go for a well-being ambition. I think we're not going to achieve any of these sorts of big long-term changes unless we move away from focusing or chasing aggregate GDP growth. It's not going to win them the next election, right? Because unless the benefits of that growth is distributed fairly, or more importantly, people are feeling more secure in their lives, the sort of deliverism of growth ain't going to win it for them. So I think they've got an opportunity still to reframe it to being something else, and then it gives you the focus on good quality support for people out of work, on good quality jobs for people, and leaning into some of those big challenges coming down the line, including, for example, I saw a question about a 4-day working week. NEF is a 4-day working week employer, which means I'm about to start my weekend in a couple of hours' time. It's rethinking the nature of work that's going to get them the sort of long-term benefits, I think. Thanks.
Thank you, Danny. Naomi?
I would say I'd go back to what I was saying earlier and say that the government should really focus on implementing all of the reforms and proposals that it's already set out, and focus on implementing those reforms effectively, and scale up things like the youth guarantee and the economic inactivity trailblazers.
Brilliant. And Delphine?
I wouldn't pretend this is the single biggest thing, but in the labour market space, I think it would be really helpful if they could get on top of some of the many issues about implementing the Employment Rights Bill that are in government's control, and in particular say how government itself is going to do more to find out what kind of work is taking place under the radar in parts of the labour market where enforcement isn't so good.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for joining us. So I think that's a positive note. Go for implementation, scale up, and go for well-being. So that is a good end to this discussion. So thank you very much for everyone for joining us. Thank you so much to Danny, Naomi, and Delphine. The Work Foundation will be doing more events over the rest of the year, so please do look at our website for that. But for now, I hope everyone has a good afternoon. Goodbye.